Welcome to the second part of Chapter 12. This lecture is actually going to pull from several different sections of this text about the various parts of the central nervous system. So we'll look at kind of the four major parts of the brain, as well as the anatomy of the spinal cord. So we'll kind of go over some of the anatomy of the central nervous system. So when we talk about the central nervous system, we are, of course, talking about both the brain and the spinal cord. So it's not just brain structures, even though most of the bulk of this chapter is about the brain because it's a very complicated organ. The spinal cord is included in the central nervous system, and you can see the spinal cord kind of descending down from the brain here. There are four parts to an adult brain. The largest of which accounts for most of the bulk of the brain, is the cerebral hemispheres. This is our cognitive brain. When we think of brain colloquially and what our brain kind of does for us, it's really the cerebral hemispheres that most of us think of when we think of that little wrinkled organ that's in our head. We also have the diencephalon, which is a relay and kind of homeostasis center for us. The cerebellum back here is a motor center and equilibrium center for us. And then the brainstem is this portion here in green, and it is sometimes referred to as our lizard brain because essentially it's the most kind of primitive part of our brain. A lot of functionality gets processed in the brainstem, but it very kind of life functions, not really kind of high level thought. So it's much more primitive than, say, the cerebral hemispheres, which are really complicated. So we're going to start with the cerebral hemispheres. It's actually two halves. There's a right cerebral hemisphere and a left cerebral hemisphere. They are fairly equal in terms of what they do, although there is a little bit of kind of division of labor between the two hemispheres. They are separated by the longitudinal fissure here. And you can see they are not smooth. There's what we call sulci and gyri, which are all these convolutions in our brain. And we'll talk about what they're for here in just a second. There are 5 different lobes to the cerebrum. They should look fairly familiar because the bones that cover them have the same names. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then there's a tiny internal lobe called the insula. You can also then see the brainstem up front here, and then the cerebellum in the back, kind of just underneath the cerebrum, separated from the cerebrum by the transverse fissure. So here you can see the 5 lobes again: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then this really kind of interior lobe called the insula. I always think insulated, so it's a very interior lobe. Separating the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe is the central sulcus. Separating the temporal lobe from the parietal lobe is the lateral sulcus. And then back here we have the parieto-occipital sulcus, separating the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. Oh, excuse me, from the occipital lobe. Now, the gyri and the sulci, sulcus singular, gyrus singular, essentially what they are the ridges and the grooves that we see, that kind of wrinkling that we see in our brain. And what this allows us to do in terms of our brain is have more surface area. And by having more surface area, we can pack in more gray matter cortex, which means we can pack in more neurons. And by packing in more neurons, we get more cognitive power. And so the gyri are the ridges, the sulci are the grooves, and then those fissures are kind of those deeper grooves that we see separating, for instance, the cerebellum from the cerebrum, or separating the 2 lobes of the cerebrum. So the sulci and the gyri are very important in terms of allowing us to have really good cognitive power. So we'll talk about the cerebral cortex in a little bit more detail in the class. But the cerebral cortex is part of the cerebral gray matter. And it's really, really, like actually a really tiny bit of the brain in terms of like depth, because it's really only about 3 meters deep in your brain. But 40% of the mass of the brain is in the cerebral cortex because it's got all of the cell bodies of these neurons for most of our brain. So the cerebral cortex is really pretty much your brain's CPU. It is where your conscious mind is. So all of your ability to be aware of things, your ability to sense things, to initiate motor movement, so to walk and talk and all that happy jazz, to communicate, to form words, to have memories, to understand things, to have a personality, all of it. Everything that you think of as you is really in your cerebral cortex there. The other bit of gray matter in the cerebrum is what it's called the basal nuclei, or sometimes referred to as the basal ganglia. You can see them here in the little diagram. So it's the caudate nucleus, the putamen, and the globus pallidus here. So you can see it's a little bit of kind of internal gray matter. So most of the gray matter of the brain is that superficial cortex, but there's a little bit of internal gray matter. And the basal ganglia, the basal nuclei, they're important in terms of kind of regulating some of our muscle movement, particularly in kind of making sure that the intensity of our movement is appropriate so that we're not, you know, like a fly lands on you and you slap somebody in the face, right? We don't want that to happen. You want kind of the amount of movement that you do to kind of match what's going on around you, and the basal nuclei are kind of important in doing that. They also help us kind of filter out some of the kind of inappropriate things so that we respond again appropriately. And they do also play a little bit of a role in some of our cognition and some of our emotion, but really they're kind of muscle regulators primarily. When it comes to the cerebral white matter, we are then talking about kind of all of the rest of the mass of the cerebrum. And the white matter is all of the kind of myelinated axons, right? So it's all sending and receiving information, essentially. It's just connecting pretty much all the other parts of the cerebrum. So connecting, you know, right hemisphere to left hemisphere, or connecting the cortex to the basal ganglia, or connecting the cortex to the brainstem, or the brainstem to the cortex. So kind of all of the communication between the parts of the brain is going to travel through the white matter, because they're tracks, they're roads. There are 3 different types of tracks: association tracks, commissural tracks, and projection tracks. So association tracks connect parts of the brain that are in the same hemisphere. So, for instance, if the right motor cortex was speaking to the right premotor cortex, something like that, but parts of the same hemisphere. The commissural fibers, the most important of which and the largest of which is the corpus callosum here, is connecting the cerebral hemispheres. And in fact, the corpus callosum has such almost seamless communication between the 2 hemispheres that your right brain talks to your left brain really very, very, very easily. And then the projection fibers, the projection tracks, are the ones that are connecting higher brain centers to lower brain centers and vice versa. So we're talking about going from the cortex down to the brainstem, or from the brainstem up to the cortex, or from the basal nuclei to the cortex, or from the diencephalon to the cortex, kind of all of the communication, shall we say, up and down. So association tracks, commissural tracks, and projection tracks in the cerebral white matter. The other part of the brain is known as the diencephalon. It sits kind of underneath the corpus callosum here, and this is a really important structure it's actually not just a structure, it's actually 3 structures that are paired on both the right side of the body and left side of the body. What we call the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. And the third ventricle is actually enclosed by the diencephalon, and the diencephalon plays several really important roles in the body in terms of making sure stuff gets to where it should get to in terms of information flows, and then the hypothalamus plays a huge role in terms of the kind of homeostasis of our body, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. The most primitive part of our brain is the brainstem. So it's 3 parts, kind of just inferior to the thalamus. So we've got the midbrain, the pons, and then the medulla oblongata. And so one of the jobs of the brainstem is to connect the higher brain centers to the spinal cord, and to connect the spinal cord to those higher brain centers. So there's a lot of tracks, white matter running kind of all throughout the brainstem, so that we can connect those higher brain centers to the lower brain centers and to the spinal cord. And because this is a really primitive part of our brain, all of the stuff that we think of in terms of like vital signs, you know, is your heart beating, are you breathing, all of those kind of automatic behaviors are really regulated here in the brainstem. It is also the origination point for 10 of our 12 cranial nerves. So we're a really important part of the brain in that sense as well. The cerebellum sits behind, kind of posterior to the brainstem, and kind of just inferior to the occipital lobe of the cerebrum. Like the cerebrum, the cerebellum has both outer kind of cerebellar gray matter cortex and inner white matter. So if you look carefully at the white matter of the cerebellum, you'll see it looks sort of like a tree, like the branches of a tree with no leaves. And so the white matter of the cerebellum is called the arbor vitae. Arbor means tree, vitae means life, so we're talking about tree of life. There are 2 lobes. You can see there's an anterior lobe here and a posterior lobe here, separated by that horizontal fissure. See, anterior lobe, posterior lobe. And again, kind of outer gray matter cortex. You'll notice our little funky guy here. This is called a homunculus. One of the main jobs of the cerebellum is to help regulate our motor function so that we can move in a coordinated fashion, and we can actually map our body onto the cerebellum, which we can actually do with the cerebrum as well, as you'll see. So those are the 4 parts of our brain: the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The other part of the central nervous system is then the spinal cord, and you can see the spinal cord descending down the vertebral column here within those vertebral foramen. It's roughly broken into similar parts to what we see with the vertebrae. So there's a cervical part of the spinal cord, a thoracic part of the spinal cord, and then a lumbar part of the spinal cord. And the spinal cord actually ends about L1, L2, and then actually descends down as a series of nerves called the conus, it ends at the conus medullaris, and then the nerves descend down as the cauda equina. So cauda means tail, equina means horse, and so we're talking about kind of a horse tail. If you ever looked at the tail of a horse, it's got that big kind of swayy, kind of flowy tail, and that's what we have here, is this kind of cascade of spinal nerves descending down into the sacral part of the spinal cord, vertebral column. So of course the job for our spinal cord is communication to and from the brain, and then a lot of our reflex centers are also here in the spinal cord. Things that like pain reflexes, like with, you step on a nail and you withdraw your foot real quickly, things like that. You'll notice that there's an enlargement here in the cervical area of the spinal cord, and then also an enlargement in the lumbar area of the spinal cord, and that is due to, this is the where our nerves exit and enter for our limbs. So for the upper limb, they enter and exit the spinal cord here in the cervical enlargement, and then for the lower limb, they enter and exit through the lumbar enlargement primarily. And so it just needs a little bit more kind of bulk to it in order to accommodate the entry and exit of those nerves. The spinal cord has a similar set of protection to the brain, so it's surrounded by bone, right? In this case, the vertebral foramen and the vertebrae, unlike the brain, which has the skull. There's also an epidural space, which again is filled with some nice fatty tissue, makes a nice little cushion. It has the 3 meninges, just as the brain does, so outer double layer dura mater, web-like arachnoid mater, and then the kind of vascular, kind of areolar type pia mater. And then we have the cerebral spinal fluid in all of the submeningeal spaces, as well as the central canal of the spinal cord. So you can see here is the spinal cord here. You can see here are 2 of the nerves kind of coming out of the spinal cord, and you can see what we call the dorsal root ganglion, which contains the cell bodies of all of our kind of sensory neurons. So the gray matter for the spinal cord is not interior, but not exterior like it is in the cerebrum, but more interior. So it's that butterfly or the H kind of smack in the middle of the spinal cord. So the dorsal horns contain interneurons, particularly for sensory information, so afferent information that's coming into the central nervous system from these sensory neurons and from some of these sensory nerves. The ventral horns are mostly motor neurons, so they're kind of sending outgoing signals in terms of motor efferent information. And then in the thoracic and upper lumbar regions of the spinal cord, you will also see some lateral horns. You won't see them in the cervical areas. You won't see them in other places, but in some of the kind of thoracic areas, you'll see these lateral horns, and they are motor neurons for the sympathetic nervous system. So some kind of autonomic features. In terms of the white matter of the spinal cord, it is pretty much all the rest of the area of the spinal cord outside of the H or the butterfly. The spinal cord is a mirror image. So that stuff on the right side of the body and the left side of the body both has information going to and from the brain. So it is a mirror image here. So you can see we generally break these myelinated tracts and again, kind of communication roadways. They get grouped together typically by kind of where they are going, what their function is. So ascending tracts are taking sensory information up to the higher centers, and then descending tracts are sending information down from the higher centers, so more motor information. And then there are some commissural, say like that will connect kind of right spinal cord to left spinal cord, just as we saw we had commissural fibers in the cerebrum as well. So you can see this is an ascending tract. This is also an ascending track because, again, mirror images. This is one of our descending tracks. So this is also a descending track. Now you have to keep in mind that when you look at an image like this, you are looking at just a cross section of the spinal cord. When we talk about these tracks, when we talk about these ascending and descending tracks, we are talking about chains of neurons that descend up and down the spinal cord. When you look at an image like this, you are looking at just a cross section. Imagine taking a power cord and kind of slicing through it and looking inside. That's what you are looking at here. We will look at the tracks themselves in the class, this upcoming class, because it really confuses people. So I definitely want to make sure that we go over that in class. But that is kind of the gist of central nervous system anatomy. Like I said, we will talk a little bit more about some of the functionality of these parts, and then also some hopefully high-level thinking and more kind of high-level cognition in the class.